Snow swirled over the edge of the high plains where the wind cut sharp as a blade and the sky stretched cold and endless. In that wide, lonesome land, winter didn't knock before entering. It just came in hard, uninvited, and took whatever warmth it pleased. On the edge of a small American village in the late 1800s, a young woman stood beside the train depot, clutching a worn carpet bag and a letter that had started to fade around the creases. Her breath rose in little white puffs as she whispered the words she had memorized from it. $1. Room and work guaranteed. Must be willing to live far from town. Her name was Clara, though no one in that place knew it yet. Her life had been nothing but closed doors and sideways glances since the doctor's verdict. She couldn't bear children. In a time when a woman's worth was measured by her ability to fill a cradle, that news had been the nail in her coffin. The small-town gossip had chased her from her home, and the man she once planned to marry had stopped calling her name. So when she read the rancher's ad tacked to a notice board at the general store, help wanted, $1 for transport and boarding, honest work for a willing heart. She took it as a sign, but as the whistle of the arriving train echoed across the plains, Clara's courage trembled. What sort of man sold hope for $1? What kind of life waited beyond that track? The townsfolk she passed on her way here had whispered about him. That rancher's half wild, they said. Keeps to himself since his wife passed. Others said his land stretched farther than a man could ride in a day, that cattle roamed free among canyons and streams. They called him the widowed rancher of Dry Creek, a man known more for his silence than his kindness. The conductor shouted, and the train doors creaked open. Clara stepped aboard with her head low, heart pounding, and clutching that single silver dollar, her payment, her proof, her ticket to a place no one else dared to go. The ride lasted hours, maybe longer. The landscape rolled past, shifting from snow-laced hills to rugged open plains. When the train finally stopped, she was the only passenger left. The station was no more than a wooden shed and a water tower. She stepped down, boots crunching against the frost. A wagon waited near the fence line, hitched to 2 chestnut horses. The man standing beside it wore a long coat dusted with snow. His hat shadowed his face, but his presence was large. Broad shoulders, steady posture, and the quiet confidence of someone used to being alone. He didn't greet her right away, just studied her as though trying to decide if she was real. "You the one answered my notice?" His voice was deep, low, carrying across the cold air. Clara nodded, her hands tightening on the bag. "Yes, sir." I brought the dollar." She held it out as if it were something sacred. He took it without looking at it, slid it into his coat pocket, then nodded toward the wagon. "Climb up. It's a long ride home." They rode in silence for miles. The snow fell thicker now, gathering on her cloak, on the brim of his hat, on the horses' manes. The sound of hooves on frozen dirt was the only rhythm between them. She wanted to ask questions, what kind of work she'd be doing if there were other folks at the ranch. But his expression didn't invite talk. His eyes stayed fixed on the trail ahead, hard and unreadable. When he finally spoke, it startled her. "You've done ranch work before?" "No, sir. But I learn fast," she said, trying to sound braver than she felt. He nodded once, as if that was enough. Then, after another mile, he said something that made her heart skip. "You'll earn your keep if you can handle yourself. The place is quiet, suits me fine, but it can get lonely out there." There was a weight in his words she didn't know how to answer. By the time they reached his land, night had fallen. The ranch was nothing like she'd imagined. It wasn't grand or lively, but it was solid. A long, low house made of pine logs with smoke curling from the chimney, and a barn standing proud against the wind. There was a warmth in the glow of the windows that tugged at her chest. He helped her down from the wagon and led her inside. The room was plain but tidy, a fire burning steady, a table with 2 chairs and the scent of wood smoke and stew. She caught sight of a photograph on the mantel, a woman in a faded dress holding a small boy. The rancher noticed her glance but said nothing. He set down his hat and gestured toward the table. "You'll have a roof, meals, and a share of what you help raise. I pay fair. You do your work, we'll get along." Clara nodded, feeling the heat of the fire seep through her cold bones. "Thank you, sir. I'm grateful." He hesitated as if searching for the right words. "You can call me Boone," he said finally. Something in his tone softened the air between them. For the first time that day, Clara smiled. Over the next few days, she learned how to move through the rhythm of ranch life, feeding chickens before dawn, hauling water, mending fences alongside Boone when the snow lightened. He didn't speak much, but when he did, His words were sure and honest. She could tell he'd been hurt before. It was in the way he kept his distance, in the way his eyes sometimes lingered on the photo above the fire. Yet, there was kindness too, in the cup of coffee he left for her each morning, in the way he made sure she never worked past dusk. But whispers from the nearby town reached her through the supply driver who came once a week. "That rancher's a strange one," he said with a grin. "Paid $1 for a woman who can't give him a family. Folks say he's either desperate or a fool." Clara tried not to let it bother her, but the words clung like burrs. Why did he bring me here? She wondered. Boone never asked about her past, never pried. But one night as they sat by the fire, she found the courage to ask. "Why me?" she said softly. "You could have found someone stronger, younger." He looked at her for a long moment, the firelight flickering across his face. "Because I don't need another person chasing after what can't be helped," he said finally. "I just needed someone who wouldn't run from the quiet." Something in his voice trembled, not weakness but a truth that made her chest ache. She wanted to say something back, to tell him that quiet was all she had left, but the words tangled in her throat. As winter pressed on, their unspoken bond deepened. They worked side by side, ate in silence, and sometimes, just sometimes, laughed. She caught glimpses of the man beneath the hard shell, the way he talked to his horses as if they were old friends, the way he lingered by the window at dusk, eyes distant. Then one night a storm rolled in fierce and heavy. The wind howled through the valley, and something crashed in the barn. Boone went out to check, but when he didn't return, Clara grabbed her lantern and ran into the snow. Lightning flashed over the plain, and through the blur of white she saw him, trapped under a fallen beam, his coat soaked, breath short. Panic surged through her as she dropped to her knees beside him. "Boone, I'll get you out, hold on." He gritted his teeth, voice rough. "You shouldn't have come out here." But she didn't listen. She pushed, pulled, fought against the weight until her hands bled, and just as she managed to free him, the lantern fell, its flame flickering dangerously close to the hay. In that instant, their eyes met, hers wide with fear, his steady with something else entirely, something that felt like a confession waiting to be spoken. The wind roared again and the flame leapt higher. Neither of them knew then that the storm outside would be nothing compared to the storm about to rise between them, one that would test faith, loyalty, and the meaning of what it truly meant to belong. And somewhere in that wild, frozen night, the $1 she'd paid would turn out to be worth more than either of them had ever imagined. The wind screamed through the barn rafters that night, fierce and wild, like it had a soul of its own. Clara's heart pounded as she dragged Boone away from the flames that licked the edge of the fallen beam. The hay smoldered, sparks flying, and the lantern's fire began to spread faster than she could stomp it out. She pulled Boone by his arm, her breath coming in sharp, cold bursts. He groaned but didn't fight her. Together they stumbled into the snow, collapsing just outside the barn doors as the fire climbed higher. For a long moment neither spoke. The night was black, the storm swallowing every sound but the crackle of burning wood. Boone tried to stand, but pain pulled him back down. His shoulder looked wrong, twisted from the fall. Clara knelt beside him, wrapping her shawl around his arm to steady it. Her hands trembled, but her voice was firm. "You need a doctor," she said. He shook his head. "No doctors coming out here in this weather. I'll manage." The flames from the barn lit up his face, turning his eyes to dark amber. He looked past her, watching the fire consume the only shelter for his livestock. She followed his gaze and felt her chest tighten. 2 of the horses were trapped inside. Before she could move, Boone grabbed her wrist. "No," he rasped. "You go near that, we'll both burn." She froze, torn between his warning and the cries of the animals inside. The wind drove the smoke into her face, stinging her eyes. She wanted to run, to do something, but she stayed where she was, the storm beating down on them both. By morning, the fire was out. The barn stood half-collapsed, blackened and hollow. Boone's arm hung in a sling Clara had made from her own petticoat. He didn't speak much while they worked through the wreckage. His silence wasn't anger, it was something heavier. The land itself seemed to share it, quiet and cold, as if mourning alongside him. That day marked a change between them. The space that had once been filled with cautious distance now carried a strange kind of closeness. Quiet understanding, perhaps, or survival's bond. Clara began taking on more of the ranch work while Boone healed. She mended fences, milked the lone cow that had survived, even led the horses down to the stream for water. At night, they ate by the fire, the warmth and flickering light softening the shadows on their faces. Boone would sit with his injured arm resting against his chest, his good hand wrapped around a mug of coffee. Sometimes she caught him looking at her, not with the guarded expression he used to wear, but with something like wonder or confusion. "You don't scare easy," he said one evening, almost to himself. Clara smiled faintly. "Neither do you." He gave a low laugh, rough and tired. "Maybe that's our problem." The days passed slow, measured by the rhythm of chores and the moody turns of the weather. Clara started to learn the land, where the creek split into two streams, where the coyotes called after dusk, where wildflowers would bloom come spring. Boone taught her how to mend a saddle, how to judge a storm by the color of the clouds, how to move quietly around a horse that didn't yet trust her. But beneath those lessons lingered unspoken things. He never told her much about his past, and she never pressed. Yet she often caught him standing by the photograph on the mantel, his wife and child. The way he looked at it wasn't the way a man looked at a memory he'd made peace with. It was the look of someone still carrying a wound. One afternoon, when the thaw finally began, and the first patches of brown earth peeked through the melting snow, Clara found Boone outside the barn ruins. He was stacking new lumber, one board at a time despite his shoulder still being tender. She walked up with a basket of bread she'd baked that morning. "You shouldn't be lifting that yet," she said softly. He didn't look at her. "Can't let it sit too long. Work keeps me sane." She set the basket down, watching him for a moment. "You lost more than a barn that night, didn't you?" His hands froze mid-motion. He didn't answer right away. Then finally he said, "That barn was built the year my boy was born. He took his first steps right there in the hay. I buried him and his ma on that ridge when the fever came through." Clara's throat tightened. "I'm sorry." He nodded, still not meeting her eyes. "Wasn't your fault." "Wasn't anyone's. But I can't look at this place without thinking about what I couldn't fix." Her heart ached for him. She wanted to tell him she understood, that she too carried something that couldn't be fixed. But the words stuck. The truth about her infertility was something she rarely spoke aloud. It had been easier to let people make their own judgments than to explain how it felt to live with a heart full of love and no one to give it to. Over the next weeks, they rebuilt together. Each nail, each plank seemed to mend more than just wood. It mended the silence between them. Boone began talking more, sharing small things, stories of his childhood in Missouri, the first horse he ever broke, the storm that nearly took his herd. And sometimes, he'd ask about her life before she came to the ranch. She told him bits and pieces, how her father had been a tailor, how her mother had died young, how she'd once thought she'd have a family of her own. She left out the part about the doctor's words that changed everything. But Boone seemed to sense there was more behind her careful tone. One evening, as they watched the sunset from the porch, he said quietly, "You came here running from something, didn't you?" Clara's hands folded in her lap. "From everything, I suppose." He nodded slowly. "Seems that's how most folks end up out here, running till they find a place that doesn't ask questions." She looked out across the fields, where the fading light painted the grass in shades of gold and gray. Maybe some places don't need answers. Maybe they just give you room to breathe. Boone turned toward her then, and for a moment their eyes met. Two people who had lost too much but still dared to keep living. The moment hung between them, fragile and heavy, until he looked away. But life on the ranch wasn't done testing them. One morning a stranger rode in from town. He was a tall man with a slick coat and a smile too sharp to trust. Boone met him at the gate while Clara watched from the porch. "Name's Teller," the man said. "Heard your barn caught fire. Shame about that. I'm buying land up north, thought you might be looking to sell." Boone's jaw tightened. "Not selling," Teller chuckled. "You might want to think on it. Folks say this place isn't what it used to be. Too much work for one man." His gaze flicked toward Clara. "Or one woman." Boone's tone hardened. "You can leave now." Teller tipped his hat, but his smile lingered. "Don't take too long to decide. There's money in change, Boone. You can't rebuild what's already gone." As the stranger rode off, Clara saw something shift in Boone's eyes, a shadow she hadn't seen before. That night he was quiet again, his old defenses creeping back. She didn't know if it was pride, guilt, or fear that unsettled him, but she could feel the distance between them return. Days later, the storms came back, this time with rain instead of snow. The ground turned to mud, the river swelled, and the cattle began to wander toward higher ground. Boone worked from dawn till dusk, refusing rest. Clara followed him, helping where she could, even when he told her to stay inside. One evening, after they'd gathered the last of the herd near the ridge, he finally spoke what had been eating at him. "I can't lose this place. Clara, it's all I've got left that's mine." She met his gaze, her voice steady. "Then you won't lose it. You've still got me here." He stared at her as if weighing the truth in her words. "You don't owe me anything." "I know," she said softly. "But maybe I need something to hold on to, too." The rain drummed on the roof, and for a long moment, there was only silence between them. The kind of silence that carried more meaning than words ever could. But deep down, both knew something had begun to change. Boone's grief no longer seemed endless, and Clara's heart no longer felt hollow. Still, neither dared to say what they both felt. It wasn't time yet, not while uncertainty hung over their heads like a gathering storm. Because behind the hills, where the sky darkened again, a new threat was rising, one that would test how much they could endure together, and what love might mean when it was born not from ease but from survival itself. And as the wind shifted through the valley, Clara couldn't shake the feeling that her story on this ranch, the story that began with a single dollar, was far from over. The days that followed brought a strange quiet to the ranch. The rain stopped, the ground dried, and a soft wind carried the scent of spring grass across the open plains. But beneath that peace, Clara felt something shift, like the calm that comes before a storm. Boone was different. He spoke less, worked longer, and sometimes disappeared at dawn to ride the boundaries of his land. When he came back, his face carried that same guarded look he'd worn when the stranger teller had first appeared. Clara tried to keep her mind on work. The ranch needed rebuilding. The barn, the fences, the spring house. But every time she caught Boone standing alone at the ridge, staring out toward the horizon, she knew something was troubling him. One evening, as she brought supper to the porch, she found him cleaning his old rifle. His movements were careful, deliberate. "You expecting trouble?" she asked. He paused, glancing at her. "Man doesn't expect trouble out here. He ends up buried by it." His tone was calm, but there was something behind it, something unspoken. Clara set the tray down and stepped closer. "Is it about that man? Teller?" Boone gave a short nod. "He's not buying land for himself. He's part of a company, railwaymen trying to take every stretch of ground from here to the canyon. If they can't buy it, they find ways to make folks leave." Clara frowned. "You think they'll come after this place?" "I know they will," he said quietly. "I've seen what happens when money wants what it doesn't own." That night, Clara couldn't sleep. She lay awake listening to the wind tapping at the windows, thinking about what Boone had said. The ranch wasn't just a patch of dirt. It was everything he had left of his family. Losing it would break him. And yet, she could see the odds stacked against them. Over the next few days, signs of trouble began to appear. Fence posts along the north pasture were cut clean through, and one of the water troughs was smashed to splinters. Boone said little, but Clara could see the fire building in his eyes. He started keeping his rifle close, and the horses grew restless, sensing the tension around them. One afternoon, while Boone was out checking the far creek, Clara heard footsteps near the house. She looked out the window and froze. Teller stood by the gate again, holding a piece of paper. His grin was polite, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Afternoon, ma'am," he called out, tipping his hat. "Is Boone around?" Clara stepped outside, keeping her distance. "He's not here." "That's a shame. I've got papers that'll make things easier for him. He doesn't have to lose everything if he signs now." Her stomach tightened. "He said no." Teller shrugged. "Sometimes no just means a man needs convincing. I'd hate to see anyone get hurt over a patch of dirt." Clara felt her heart pound, but she didn't let it show. "You'd best leave before he gets back." Teller smirked, slipping the papers into his coat. "I'll be seeing you soon, ma'am. Maybe next time he'll think clearer." She watched him ride away, dust rising behind his horse. Her hands were shaking when she went back inside. Boone returned later, muddy and worn, and she told him what had happened. He didn't say a word at first. Then he stood, his jaw tight. "They're trying to scare us," he said, "but I'm not leaving this land." The edge in his voice frightened her more than Teller's threats. That night, Boone saddled a horse and rode toward town. Clara stayed by the window, watching his figure disappear into the dark. The silence of the ranch felt heavier than usual. Hours passed, and she sat by the fire, staring at the old photograph on the mantel. She wondered if Boone's wife had known this same quiet fear, waiting for a man who might not come back. When Boone returned at dawn, his clothes were damp and his expression unreadable. "Town's crawling with those men," he said, dropping into a chair. "They're buying folks out left and right. Half the valley's already signed over their land." Clara poured him coffee and sat beside him. "What happens if you don't?" He looked into the fire. "Then they'll find another way to take it. Men like that don't stop when money fails." His words left a chill in the air. As spring deepened, the ranch began to breathe again. The fields turned green, wildflowers dotted the hills, and the river ran full. But the peace was only on the surface. Boone started making preparations, reinforcing fences, moving supplies closer to the house, teaching Clara how to shoot. She protested at first, but he insisted. "It's not for fighting," he said. "It's for surviving." She practiced. Behind the barn each evening, her hands trembling at first but growing steadier. Boone's patience surprised her. He stood beside her, giving quiet instructions, never raising his voice. There was something almost gentle about the way he taught her, even as the air between them carried unspoken tension. One evening after practice, they sat by the porch as the sun dipped low. Boone handed her a small bundle wrapped in cloth. "Found this when I cleared the old shed," he said. She unwrapped it and saw a pair of tiny leather boots, child size. Worn, but carefully made. She held them softly, her throat tightening. "Your boys?" He nodded. "Made them myself. Couldn't bring myself to throw them away." Clara looked down at the boots, the weight of them small but heavy with meaning. She wanted to comfort him, to say something that might ease the ache she saw in his eyes. But all she managed was a whisper. "You kept them for a reason." "Maybe," he said quietly. "Or maybe I just never learned how to let go." The wind moved through the grass, carrying the scent of rain again. A few days later, trouble finally came. Boone was out mending the creek fence when gunshots cracked through the still morning air. Clara dropped the bucket she was carrying and ran to the window. She couldn't see where the sound came from, only the echo rolling through the valley. Moments later, Boone came riding hard, his horse lathered with sweat. "They're here," he said, breathless. "3 men, same ones from town. They're setting fire to the south field." Clara's blood ran cold. She followed him to the door, heart pounding. The horizon was dark with smoke. Boone grabbed his rifle. "Stay inside," he ordered. "I'm not hiding," she said, voice shaking but firm. He hesitated, then handed her a smaller gun. "Then stay close to me." They rode out together, wind whipping through their coats, the smoke growing thicker as they neared the ridge. Flames licked across the dry grass, eating through the lower pasture. Boone jumped from his horse, shouting to the men who stood near the fire, their faces half hidden by hats. "This land's mine," he shouted. Teller's voice carried back through the smoke. "Not for long. Should have taken the offer, Boone. Now you'll lose everything." Boone raised his rifle but didn't fire. "Put it out, now." For a tense moment, no one moved. Then one of the men tossed a torch toward the fence line. Boone fired, the shot cracking through the air, and the torch dropped harmlessly into the dirt. The men scattered, galloping toward the trees. Teller turned once, his grin cold. "You can't win this, Boone. You'll burn out before we do." By the time the flames were under control, most of the pasture was ruined. Boone stood amid the smoke, breathing hard, his hands blackened with ash. Clara walked to him, her face pale. "They'll come back," she said quietly. "I know," he replied. "But they'll find we're not easy to break." Over the following weeks, Boone tried to rebuild again, but the damage ran deeper than the land. The crops he'd planned to plant were gone, and several cattle had strayed into the burned fields. He grew quieter, his movements heavier, like a man carrying too much weight. Clara watched him struggle, wanting to help, but unsure how. Then, one morning, a letter arrived from town. Boone opened it slowly, his expression darkening as he read. It was from the county office, a notice of unpaid taxes one teller's company had somehow manipulated. If he couldn't pay within a month, the land would be auctioned. Clara's heart sank. "They're forcing you out." Boone crushed the letter in his fist. "Not yet." He looked at her then, and for the first time, she saw something almost desperate in his eyes, a fear that went beyond losing land. It was the fear of losing meaning, of being left with nothing to fight for. That night, as rain began to fall again, Boone stood by the window, staring into the dark. Clara watched him, knowing there was more at stake now than soil or fences. This place was his past, his promise, his last connection to the people he'd loved, and though she didn't say it out loud, she felt it too. This land had become her refuge, the first place where she felt seen not for what she couldn't give, but for who she was. The storm outside grew heavier, thunder rolling over the plains. Boone turned from the window, eyes set with a quiet fire. "If they think they can take this place," he said, voice low, "they're in for a fight." Clara met his gaze, her fear fading into resolve. "Then we fight." The thunder cracked again, shaking the windows. Somewhere in the distance, a single light flickered across the ridge, the kind carried by a rider in the dark. And in that moment, Clara knew the storm ahead wasn't just weather, it was war. The storm rolled in heavy that night, the kind that carried a charge in the air strong enough to make the horses restless and the dogs whine. Wind howled through the eaves of the ranch house, rattling the shutters like the world was coming apart outside. Boone stood by the front window, his rifle leaning against the wall, his jaw tight. Clara sat near the fire, pretending to sew but watching him from the corner of her eye. She could feel the tension in him, the same way one could feel the air before lightning struck. Neither spoke for a long while. The fire cracked softly, throwing orange light across Boone's face. He looked worn, more than she had ever seen him. Weeks of sleepless nights, lost fields, and the growing threat from Teller's men had carved lines of worry deep into him. Yet there was a steadiness in his eyes, something that refused to break. Finally, Clara set down her needle. "You think they'll come tonight?" It wasn't a question. Boone nodded slowly. "The taxes are due tomorrow. If they mean to take it, they'll move before morning." She felt her stomach twist. "You can still go to the sheriff. Maybe—" "There's no sheriff left worth his badge," he interrupted quietly. "Half the law in this county's bought off by Teller's company." Clara's hands clenched in her lap. "Then what are we supposed to do? Wait until they burn us out?" Boone turned from the window and looked at her. "We stand our ground, same as we've done every day since that first storm." His voice softened. "You don't have to stay, Clara. If anything happens, I'm not leaving." She cut in, her voice trembling but firm. "This is my home too now." Boone's expression shifted, a flicker of something unspoken in his eyes. He nodded once, and that was the end of it. The wind outside rose again, carrying with it the faint echo of hooves. Boone stiffened. He reached for his rifle and stepped closer to the door, motioning for her to stay back. Clara moved toward the window instead, peering through a slit in the curtain. At first, all she could see was darkness, then movement. A lantern's glow, faint but steady, bobbing in the distance. Then another, and another. "They're here," she whispered. Boone blew out the lamp by the door, plunging the room into shadow. The only light left came from the fire, flickering against the walls. "Get the horses ready," he said under his breath. "If things go bad, we'll need to move fast." Clara nodded, though her hands shook as she grabbed her shawl and slipped out the back door. The rain hit her face in cold sheets, soaking her within moments. She ran to the barn, the same one they'd rebuilt together, and began untying the reins. The horses whickered nervously, their hooves shifting on the wet ground. She heard the crunch of wagon wheels approaching from the front road, voices shouting over the wind. Boone's voice cut through them, deep and sharp. "You step 1 foot past that gate, you'll regret it." Teller's reply came loud and mocking. "You're outnumbered, Boone. This land's not yours anymore. Papers say it belongs to Dry Creek Holdings now. You're trespassing on company property." "I didn't sign a thing," Boone said. "And I won't." Clara peeked through a crack in the barn wall. She could see their silhouettes now, 4, maybe 5 men on horseback, Teller at the front holding that same smug grin. One of the men carried a lantern, another had a rifle slung across his shoulder. Boone stood alone by the fence, rain dripping from the brim of his hat. Teller raised a hand. "Last chance, Boone. Walk away and I'll let you keep your skin." Boone didn't move. "You'll have to take it from me." The moment hung heavy, the kind of silence that came before chaos. Then one of Teller's men fired a shot into the air. The horses screamed, rearing against their reins. Clara ducked instinctively, heart pounding in her ears. Boone raised his rifle and fired back, hitting the lantern. It burst, flames spilling across the wet dirt. Teller's men scattered, shouting curses, the sudden firelight throwing wild shadows across the yard. Clara ran out, rain soaking her hair and dress. "Boone!" she shouted, but the wind swallowed her voice. He turned toward her, eyes fierce. "Get inside." But she didn't. Another shot rang out, hitting the porch beam beside her. She froze for half a second before diving behind a trough. Boone fired again, taking down the man who'd shot first. Teller cursed and wheeled his horse around. "Burn it all!" he yelled. Two men dismounted, running toward the barn with torches. Clara's heart lurched. "No!" she screamed, sprinting toward them before Boone could stop her. She grabbed a shovel leaning against the wall and swung it with every ounce of strength she had. It caught one man's arm, sending his torch flying into the mud. The other shoved her hard and she fell backward into the wet ground. Boone's rifle cracked again and the man dropped. Teller pulled his pistol, aiming at Boone through the rain. Clara saw it before Boone did. Without thinking, she lunged forward, shouting his name. The shot fired, loud, echoing across the valley. Boone stumbled, dropping to one knee. Clara's heart nearly stopped. "No!" she cried, running to him. She knelt beside him in the mud, grabbing his face with shaking hands. "Boone, look at me!" He grimaced, his hand pressed to his shoulder where blood darkened his coat. "I'm all right," he hissed. "Get down!" Teller was still on his horse, fumbling to reload. Boone lifted his rifle again, his movements strained but steady. Lightning flashed, turning the night white for an instant, and then Boone fired. Teller's pistol flew from his hand, landing in the mud. His horse reared, throwing him to the ground. The remaining men, seeing their leader fall, turned and rode hard into the darkness, disappearing into the storm. Rain poured harder now, washing blood and ash into the earth. Clara's breath came fast as she pressed her hand against Boone's wound. "You need help," she said, voice breaking. "You'll bleed out." He caught her wrist, his touch weak but sure. "No doctors," he murmured. "They'll send word to Teller's men. We stay quiet. We wait." She nodded, tears mixing with the rain on her cheeks. With her arm around him, she helped him back to the house. His weight was heavy, but she didn't stop until he was inside, near the fire that still burned low in the hearth. She tore strips from an old shirt, cleaning the wound as best she could. Boone winced but didn't make a sound. The bullet had gone clean through his shoulder, but the bleeding wouldn't stop. She pressed the cloth tight, whispering prayers under her breath she hadn't spoken in years. Outside, thunder rolled like the earth itself was angry. The smell of smoke still lingered, though the rain had drowned the flames. Every shadow felt like a threat. "Why don't they stop?" she whispered after a while. "Why can't they just leave us be?" Boone's voice was low, rough. "Because men like Teller don't care about land. They care about power. Taking what others love makes them feel alive." Clara looked at him, her eyes glistening in the firelight. "Then we can't let him win." He met her gaze, his breathing shallow but steady. "We won't." The night stretched long after that. Boone drifted in and out of sleep, the fever burning in him. Clara stayed awake, watching over him, listening for any sign of riders returning. Each time the wind hit the window, she reached for the rifle by the hearth, her nerves frayed thin. Near dawn, the storm broke. The sky turned pale gray and the sound of hooves echoed again, slow this time, cautious. Clara stiffened, gripping the gun. Boone stirred, his voice barely a whisper. "They're back." She went to the window and looked out. A single rider was approaching, wrapped in a dark coat, hat low against the rain. He wasn't Teller. She could tell by the shape, the steadiness of the ride. Still, she didn't trust it. When the man reached the gate, he raised a hand in greeting. "Boone Dry Creek?" he called out. Clara hesitated, then opened the door halfway. "Who are you?" "Name's Harris. Deputy out of Ridgeview County. Heard there was trouble out here. Sheriff sent me to check on things." Boone's voice came from behind her, weak but firm. "You're late." The deputy dismounted, eyes scanning the scorched yard. "Looks like I missed the worst of it." Word spreading in town. Teller and his men stirred up more than they can handle. Folks are starting to talk back. Clara's breath caught. "You mean?" Harris nodded. "He's not untouchable anymore. County board's reviewing every land claim he's filed. Might be time you finally got some justice." Boone looked toward the window, his eyes narrowing. Justice has a funny way of showing up after the fight's already done. The deputy gave a small, tired smile. Sometimes it just needs proof. When he left, the sun had started to rise, spilling gold over the wet fields. Clara stood at the porch, the air cool against her skin, her heart still racing from the night before. The land looked bruised but alive, the fences broken, the earth blackened but still standing. Boone came to the doorway behind her, his arm in a sling now. He looked weaker, but his eyes held that same fire. "They won't stop with one loss," he said quietly. "I know," Clara replied. He glanced at her, a shadow of a smile tugging at his lips. "Then we'll be ready." The sound of distant thunder rolled again, though the storm had already passed. The valley felt different now, charged, waiting. Boone's land had become the center of something larger than either of them could yet see. And as the morning light touched the horizon, Clara knew the fight wasn't over. It was only the beginning of the reckoning. The days after the storm were quiet in a way that felt strange. The air had that clean smell that always came after rain, but beneath it lingered the faint scent of smoke and gunpowder. Boone's shoulder healed slowly. Clara took care of him with steady hands, changing the bandages, making broth from what little they had left, and keeping the fire alive through the chill nights. He tried to get up too soon, as he always did, but the pain forced him back down each time. She scolded him gently for it, though a small smile always tugged at her lips when she did. Outside, the land looked broken but alive. The fences Teller's men had burned were rebuilt plank by plank. The crops they'd trampled had begun to sprout again, tiny green shoots stubbornly pushing through the dirt. Clara found it comforting, how the earth always tried again no matter what had been done to it. Boone said it was just the way of things. She thought it was something like hope. Word of the fight spread faster than either of them expected. Within a week, ranchers from nearby counties started coming by. Some brought food or tools, others just stopped to shake Boone's hand. They'd heard how he'd stood his ground against Teller's men, how he'd refused to give up the land that had been in his family since before the war. "I reckon we've all been waiting for someone to push back," one old farmer said, tipping his hat. "Didn't think it'd be you, Boone Dry Creek, but I can't say I'm surprised." Boone gave a small nod, the corner of his mouth twitching with something close to a smile. "Didn't set out to be anyone's example," he said. "Just didn't want to see good soil stolen." Clara stood beside him on the porch that day, her hands folded together. She could feel the shift in the wind, something changing not just for them but for everyone around. People were waking up, seeing that Teller and his company weren't untouchable after all. Deputy Harris rode out again a few days later with papers in hand. He handed Boone a sealed envelope with the county's stamp. "It's official," he said. "Your claim's been reinstated. Teller's deeds were forged." Clara's breath caught as Boone opened the letter. His rough hands trembled slightly when he read the words. He didn't speak for a long time. Then he looked up, his voice low but steady. "So it's over," Harris nodded. "For you, maybe. For him, he'll be answering to the court. He's lost his influence for good." Boone nodded again, his eyes drifting toward the fields. "Took long enough." After the deputy left, the silence between Boone and Clara felt different. It wasn't the heavy kind anymore, it was peaceful, settled. She sat beside him on the porch, watching the sun dip behind the hills. The sky turned the color of copper and the air was soft and warm. "You ever think it'd end like this?" she asked quietly. Boone leaned back in his chair. "Didn't think much about endings," he said. "Just about getting through each day." He glanced at her. "Didn't think I'd still be here if you hadn't run out that night," she smiled faintly. "You would have done the same for me." "Maybe," he said, his voice softer. "But I'm glad I don't have to find out." They sat in silence for a while longer, listening to the sounds of the ranch, the creak of the windmill, the low calls of the cattle, the rustle of leaves. It all felt alive again. Weeks passed and the valley began to heal. The community came together like never before. Neighbors who'd once kept to themselves now gathered to help mend fences, share food, and rebuild what had been lost. Boone's land became a kind of meeting place, a symbol of what could still be saved when people stood together. Clara helped where she could, cooking meals for the workers, tending to the injured, and even teaching the younger children to read during the slower afternoons. She had always felt like an outsider, a woman who had simply stumbled into Boone's world by accident. But now, she realized she belonged there. Every sunrise, every call from the rooster, every long day in the field stitched her closer to this land and the people who called it home. Boone, too, seemed to change. The hardness in him softened bit by bit. He still worked from dawn until dusk, but there was a quiet calm about him now. Sometimes Clara would catch him standing by the pasture fence, staring off toward the hills where the Sioux lands once stretched. She knew he was remembering, the boy she'd once helped, the debts that had come full circle, the ghosts that still lingered. One afternoon, as autumn began to creep in, Boone received a letter from up north. It was written in careful, deliberate English. The handwriting was unfamiliar, but the name at the bottom made his chest tighten. It was from the Sioux man who had come back that winter, the same one Clara had saved years before, the one who had returned to defend the farm when the cold nearly took it. The letter was short but powerful. He wrote of his people rebuilding too, of finding peace on their own land after years of struggle. He thanked Boone for keeping his word, for standing by Clara, and for protecting what was right. At the end, he'd written one line that Boone read over and over again. "The land remembers those who fight for it." Boone folded the letter carefully and placed it in the old chest near the fireplace. He didn't say much about it, but Clara saw the change in his eyes, the quiet understanding that everything had come full circle. That evening, they stood together outside as the first stars appeared. The air was cool, and the wind carried the scent of hay and earth. Boone leaned against the porch post, his arm still stiff but healing. Clara wrapped her shawl tighter around her shoulders. "Feels different now," she said softly. "Like the land can finally breathe again." Boone nodded. "It does." After a pause, he looked at her, his expression gentle. "You know, I used to think all a man needed was land and his own two hands. But I was wrong." She looked up at him. "What changed your mind?" He smiled faintly. "You did." The words hung between them, simple but heavy. Clara's heart warmed, her throat tightening as she smiled back. "Well," she said softly, "guess we both learned something." As winter came again, the valley settled into its rhythm. The snow fell softly, blanketing the earth in white. The farmhouse stood strong, the lights glowing warm in the windows. Boone and Clara spent the evenings by the fire, the air filled with the scent of pine and smoke. Sometimes neighbors stopped by, bringing stories, laughter, and the comfort of company. One night, as the snow drifted quietly outside, Clara looked over at Boone, who was sharpening his old knife by the firelight. "You ever think about leaving?" she asked. He shook his head. "No, not anymore. I think I've wandered enough for one lifetime," she smiled. "Good, because I'm not going anywhere either." He glanced at her, his eyes soft. "Didn't think you would." Outside, the wind howled faintly, but it no longer carried the same sense of threat it once had. Inside, everything felt warm, grounded. They had weathered more than storms and bullets. They had endured greed, fear, and loss, and still found something worth holding on to. When spring came, the land bloomed brighter than it had in years. The crops grew tall, the creek ran clear, and the people of the valley stood together stronger than ever. Teller's name faded into whispers, his influence gone. Boone's land, once nearly lost, became a story people told for years, a story about courage, faith, and the stubborn will to protect what matters. And though Boone never said it aloud, he knew the truth deep down, that everything he'd fought for, everything he'd rebuilt had started because one woman had refused to leave. Clara had brought warmth back into a house that had gone cold, and love back into a man who had long forgotten what it felt like. As the sun set over Dry Creek that spring, Boone stood by the fence, watching the horizon glow with gold. Clara walked up beside him, her hand brushing his. "Looks like the land's smiling again," she said. Boone looked out across the valley, his heart full. "It is," he replied softly. "And maybe, just maybe, so am I." The wind carried their laughter over the fields as the last light of day faded behind the hills. The farm stood strong, the land alive, and the two of them, finally, at peace. The fight was over, but the story of Dry Creek would live on, carried in the hearts of those who believed that even in the hardest times, kindness and courage could still change everything.